The air inside the arena wasn't electric, it was suffocating. It was late 2026, and the landscape of the WWE had shifted into something glossy, high-speed, and meticulously produced. But tonight, in the dying minutes of the main event, the polish began to crack. There was no sudden blackout, no pyrotechnics malfunctioning to signal a planned interruption. Instead, there was a palpable, uneasy stillness that seemed to bleed out from the production truck and infect the crowd. The commentary team, usually quick with a witty pivot or a breathless sell, fell into a confused silence. You could hear Michael Cole tapping his headset, his voice leaking into the hot mic with a genuine, unscripted edge of frustration, asking a producer if the feed was cut. The champion in the ring, a young star who had built her reputation on flawless athleticism, stopped mid-stride. She looked at the entrance ramp, not with the rehearsed defiance of a scripted rival, but with the genuine confusion of an employee who realizes the schedule has been thrown out the window. The giant LED screens didn't flash a logo. They flickered, oscillating between the live feed and dead gray static. It felt less like a wrestling show and more like a broadcast hijacking. The audience, usually conditioned to cheer or boo on cue, began to murmur. It was a low, buzzing sound, the sound of 30,000 people trying to process a glitch in reality. Security guards near the barricade shifted their weight, looking back at the curtain, hands hovering near their earpieces. This wasn't a work. It didn't feel like part of the show. It felt like an intrusion. The atmosphere shifted from anticipation to anxiety, the kind of heavy, humid tension that precedes a natural disaster. The show was still on the air, but the script had evaporated, leaving everyone exposed in the harsh, uncomfortable glare of the house lights. When the music finally hit, it wasn't the explosive, anthemic Celtic rock that had defined an era. It was a distorted, slowed-down echo of that familiar melody, grinding like machinery fighting against rust. There was no smoke, no steam jets, just the raw, dimly lit visual of a figure stepping out from behind the curtain. Becky Lynch walked out, but this wasn't the man who played to the back of the stadium. This was a woman who looked like she had walked through fire to get to the stage. She wore no elaborate entrance gear, no bedazzled jacket, just simple, taped-up combat gear that looked worn, as if it had seen 100 fights in shadow before this televised one. Her hair wasn't the vibrant, manicured orange of the past. It was darker, wilder, tied back in a severe knot that pulled at the skin of her face. The reaction wasn't a pop. It was a gasp that sucked the oxygen out of the arena, followed by a disjointed, chaotic wall of noise. It wasn't the rhythmic chanting of her name. It was a roar of disbelief. People didn't jump out of their seats to cheer. They stood up to verify what they were seeing. She didn't pose. She didn't smile. She didn't acknowledge the fans who were reaching out over the barricades. She walked with a terrifying, singular focus, her eyes locked on the ring, ignoring the cameraman who scrambled to get the shot. The commentary team was shouting now, their voices overlapping in a mess of shock and confusion, trying to convey that this was not on the run sheet. This felt like an invasion. She moved with a heaviness, a gravity that made the very air around her feel dense. It wasn't a hero's return. It was a reckoning arriving on 2 feet. She slid under the bottom rope, the movement efficient and devoid of flair. The champion stood in the center of the ring, the championship belt hanging loosely from her hand, her bravado stripped away by the sheer anomaly of the moment. Becky didn't ask for a microphone. She didn't need to cut a promo to explain why she was there. Her presence was the explanation. The silence returned, sharper this time. The referee, sensing the volatility, tried to step between them, but was stopped by a single, withering look from Lynch. It was the look of someone who had transcended the rules of the sport. The tension in the ring was so thick, it felt nauseating. You could see the younger wrestler's chest heaving, the realization dawning on her that she was standing across from a living legend who had nothing left to lose. Then came the contact. It wasn't a wrestling lockup. Becky simply stepped forward and placed a hand on the title belt. The champion flinched, pulling it back, and that small movement triggered an explosion. Becky didn't execute a finisher. She didn't look for a pinfall. She drove the champion into the corner with a raw, ugly aggression that looked more like a street fight than a choreographed match. The strikes were stiff, echoing through the silent arena with sickening thuds. There was no taunting, no playing to the hard cam. It was a systematic dismantling, uncomfortable to watch in its intensity. The crowd didn't know whether to cheer the return of an icon or look away from the violence. When Becky finally stepped back, leaving the champion gasping on the canvas, she looked down not with triumph, but with a hollow, haunting dissatisfaction. She hadn't come back to win. She had come back to break something. Backstage, the chaos was absolute. The camera cut to the gorilla position, usually a place of orderly production, now a hive of panicked activity. Agents were shouting into headsets, producers were scrambling to cut to commercial, but the feed stayed lingering on the monitors. We saw fleeting glimpses of the rostermen and women who had grown comfortable in the new era standing in hushed clusters, watching the screens with crossed arms and furrowed brows. This wasn't just a returning veteran. This was a destabilizing force. In the locker room, the mood wasn't celebratory. The younger talent, the ones who had risen in the vacuum Lynch left behind, looked genuinely rattled. They realized that the ceiling they thought they had reached was actually just the floor of the level Becky Lynch had returned on. Social media was already melting down, but not with the usual excitement. The timelines were filled with concern and confusion. She looks different. People typed, "Is this a work?" She looks dangerous. The news outlets were bypassing the sports pages and heading straight for the breaking news tickers. This wasn't framed as a sports entertainment comeback. It was framed as a hostile takeover. We saw a brief shot of Seth Rollins in a hallway, looking not like a supportive husband, but like a man who knew a storm had just made landfall, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The narrative wasn't about ticket sales or pay-per-view buys anymore, it was about consequence. The structure of the company, the hierarchy of the division, the safety of the status quo had all been shattered in 3 minutes of airtime. The return didn't feel like a reunion. It felt like a warning shot fired into a crowded room. The show went off the air without a sign-off from the commentary team. The final image wasn't Becky Lynch holding the title high, bathed in confetti. It was a close-up of her face, leaning against the turnbuckle, sweat causing the war paint of her exhaustion to run. Her eyes weren't focused on the fans or the camera. They were looking 1,000 yards past the arena walls. In that stillness, the audience was forced to confront the uncomfortable truth of what they had just witnessed. We demand our heroes return to us time and time again. We demand they sacrifice their bodies, their sanity, and their time with their families to entertain us. But we rarely ask what it takes for them to come back or what they leave behind when they do. Becky Lynch had returned in 2026, but she hadn't returned for the applause. The haunting look in her eyes suggested she had returned because she didn't know how to exist anywhere else. The silence of the arena as the screen faded to black was the loudest sound of the night. It was the collective realization that the man was gone, replaced by something far more real and far more tragic. She was a warrior who realized the war was the only place she made sense. The viewer was left not with the thrill of a fight card to come, but with a lingering, heavy question that would follow them long after they closed the video. When the world demands you be a legend forever, how much of yourself do you have to kill to keep the myth alive?